Thank you. Yeah,
Sorry.
Thank you. Just do one more. Yeah, no problem. Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Hi, my name's Gavin. I'm a research fellow at Lancaster University, and I'm going to talk today. The talk I'm going to give is a bit different to some of the other talks we've been listening to, in that I'm not strictly talking about a healthcare context, but really I want to talk about some work I've been doing looking at how an illness and a health issue, dementia, is represented in news media, particularly focusing on metaphorical representations, so the use of metaphor in British, in tabloids in the UK. Okay, so before I get on to the research, I first want to provide a bit of context about dementia. So I'm sure everybody in the room is familiar with it, perhaps to differing extents, but dementia is a syndrome that's characterized by progressive deterioration in the brain, and this leads to a range of symptoms, including memory loss and problems with thinking, coordination, and communication. The term dementia doesn't refer to one specific disease. It actually, it's an umbrella term, and it has over 100 different types. The most common type is Alzheimer's disease, and I think the idea of dementia as an umbrella term is visualized quite well in this graphic that was produced by Kate Swaffer. Dementia presents a major global health challenge. So in the UK, which is the context where I'm from and where I'm working, dementia currently affects around 900,000 people, and that figure is estimated to increase to 1.6 million people within the next 20 or so years. There's presently no known cure for dementia, so it's a chronic disease, and people who develop the syndrome will eventually die with it. However, and importantly, people die with dementia, they don't die of it. So dementia isn't actually a cause of death in and of itself, and people who die with dementia are most likely to die of pneumonia. We can maybe talk about that later. So, onto the research itself, and for the analysis, I compiled a database of texts, or a corpus, containing all UK national tabloid articles mentioning either the word dementia or dementias once in their headlines or 3 or more times throughout the articles. I sampled articles over a period of 10 years, between 2010 and 2019, and this gave me around 6,751 articles, and that was around 4 million words. The analytical approach I used to identifying and interpreting the use of metaphor was a sort of mixed methodology, which drew together techniques from corpus linguistics, frame analysis, and critical discourse studies. So I started by using a technique in corpus linguistics called collocation analysis. And collocation analysis is a technique which helps us to identify associations between words in a data set. So I essentially look for words which occurred frequently alongside the word dementia in the newspaper articles. So words that were sort of particularly attracted to the word dementia in the news texts. I then qualitatively analysed samples of the use of those words, those collocates, and used a framework called the prognosis metaphor identification procedure to help to determine whether or not those words tended to be used in a metaphorical sense. I then interpreted those words that I did interpret to be used metaphorically in terms of the frames that they contributed towards. So here I draw on Goffman's notion of frames as organizing principles, which help us to make sense of a thing and to represent it by foregrounding some elements and backgrounding others. Through the framing analysis, I was able to group the metaphors according to the particular aspects of dementia that each metaphor was used to represent or to frame in the news articles. And these aspects were dementia's prevalence, its causes, its symptoms and prognosis, the lived experience of dementia, and then responses to it. Importantly, my analysis was also critical. So I was interested in interpreting these metaphor and these frames as being both constitutive of and constituted by their context. So I was interested in terms of the effects of the context of production, in terms of how these metaphors might serve commercial or ideological aims of the newspapers I was investigating. But I was also interested in the broader socio-cultural context. And I wanted to think a bit about how the metaphors might shape how people experience and understand and act in relation to dementia. So onto the analysis itself, and here I want to consider some of the most frequent metaphorical framings in relation to these different aspects of dementia, beginning with its prevalence. And this was framed using metaphors belonging to a diverse range of domains, all of which conveyed a sense in which the UK's prevalence of dementia was high, but also rising. Most frequently, the articles drew on the domain of sports and competition to frame dementia as the leading cause in the country. And this was indicated in uses of words like leading, leader, overtaken, and overtook. For example, in this extract, where dementia is framed as overtaking heart disease to become the leading cause of death. Violence metaphors were also used to frame dementia prevalence, where the incidence of the condition could be quantified in terms of the number of people who've been hit by the condition, or talk about what its death toll was. Related to the violence metaphor, dementia was also construed as a weapon, so it could be characterized as a bomb and a time bomb, which I'd argue foregrounds more specifically its rising prevalence and implies that this will continue to grow to a sort of ultimately to a disastrous effect. Dementia's growing prevalence was also rendered as an epidemic, and in around a fifth of cases as a silent epidemic specifically. And at first glance, that characterization to some might not appear metaphorical, since the term already belongs to a sort of illness and health domain. But strictly speaking, the term epidemic denotes the spread of an infectious disease, which dementia is not. In general language, we find that the epidemic metaphor tends to be used to characterize an increase in frequency of some phenomenon or activity that's evaluated negatively. So things like crime or the illegal use of drugs. So therefore, this metaphor arguably contributes to a sort of negative valuation or negative prosody around dementia and the growth in dementia prevalence. Moving on to its causes, and these could be framed using a domain of movement, with certain behaviours and risk factors being construed as speeding up the development of dementia. So we get words like accelerate, accelerated, and speeds up used a lot around that. As well as focusing on environmental risks associated with dementia, the newspapers also reported on biological factors, particularly protein variants and parts of the brain to which dementia onset was attributed. So these risks could be framed through violence metaphors, whereby parts of the brain were sort of anthropomorphized, if you like, and for example, as a rogue, or being likened to a dagger that then attacks other parts of the brain to cause dementia. And as this bottom example shows, these metaphors aren't necessarily invented by the newspapers themselves, but they're borrowed from other genres and they get recycled. So in this case, it's from scientific writing. So we're beginning to see a prevalence of violence or militaristic kind of language. And this was particularly the case in how newspapers frame dementia's symptoms and its prognosis. In these cases, dementia is again anthropomorphized as an actor, which inflicts forms of violence on those who are diagnosed with it. And this can be subcategorized too. So symptoms such as memory loss, cognitive function, and even personhood are framed as being stolen by dementia, which is rendered as a thief which robs and steals from people who are diagnosed with it. Other symptoms are framed as forms of violence in more generic terms, with dementia described as something which ravages and strikes. In terms of the prognosis, the newspapers frequently foreground a fatalistic view of dementia, framing it as a murderer that kills those diagnosed with it. So we see this in a large number of highly frequent words accompanying dementia. So words like kill, killed, killer, killers, killing, and kills. And then this kind of fatalistic framing of dementia is also supported by, again, an anthropomorphic characterization of it in terms of qualities which imply dementia to be a violent actor who inflicts violence and theft willfully and deliberately. So we get words such as brutally, cruel, cruelest, heartless, and savage used to describe dementia. Consistent with the framing of dementia as a cruel and brutal actor who inflicts forms of violence, including murder, on people living with the diagnosis, the lived experience of dementia was also characterized in terms of conflict. And again, these violence tropes can be subcategorized. So people with dementia are framed as battling, facing, and struggling with dementia. And this manifested in a number of collocates. So words like battle, battled, battles, face, fight, struggle, and struggling. Other constrictions were less agentive on the part of people with dementia, though, and instead foregrounded a sense of victimhood. In such cases, people with dementia were referred to as victims or a victim. They were described as being in dementia's grip or its hold, or as being struck by dementia. Meanwhile, the framing of people with dementia as succumbing or having succumbed to dementia arguably implies an initial struggle or resistance, but an eventual failure or even potentially a surrender. Another set of metaphors which similarly frames people with dementia as objects or victims of processes are found in stories which focus in particular on cases where people with dementia have been purportedly abandoned by their relatives. And in this case, these cases are sort of metaphorically likened to that of waste disposal. So the articles describe how people with dementia are dumped in care homes or dumped in hospitals by their relatives. The negative appraisal of life with dementia is also conveyed through metaphors which frame the experience of it in horrific and apocalyptic terms. So it's likened to a hell, a horror movie, and a nightmare. And this negative evaluation of life with dementia was also conveyed more subtly through the word descent, whose use indicates a sort of spatial metaphor, which frames life with dementia as downward movement into the condition, drawing on a broader sort of down equals bad metaphor. Yet not all of the metaphors necessarily imply negative evaluations of life with dementia or foreground this sense of victimhood in people diagnosed with it. So a particularly frequent example of that is the characterization of the relationship between dementia and the person with it as one of companionship. So this was indicated in uses of words like live and living with dementia. The companionship metaphor is more flexible, I'd argue, than those that I've talked about so far in this part of the analysis, as it could be used in the articles to frame the relationship between dementia and people with it in more or less harmonious terms, as this pair of examples together demonstrates. Likewise, the metaphorical framing of dementia as a journey could be used to appraise life with the syndrome, life with the syndrome in more or less positive terms, as well as to foreground mixed experiences and also to convey dementia's progressive nature. So finally now, I want to consider the responses to dementia. So the most pervasive metaphorical domain in this category in terms of its frequency and the number of words that sort of enacted this metaphor was again violence. So most of the metaphors in this domain frame the response to dementia from society as a whole, as well as from biomedicine in terms of the development of a pharmacological cure. So this response is framed in terms of conflict in general, as well as more specifically in terms of a battle, a mission, a fight, or a war against dementia. In all the cases that I analysed, the key to victory in this battle, in this conflict, was the development of pharmacological intervention for dementia and funding for this. Relatedly, the promise of studies and pharmacological trials could be framed as having the potential to beat dementia in a race or to stop, slow, or reverse dementia's movement. And then other metaphors imply that a cure for dementia exists somewhere out there, but has yet to be discovered by scientists, who are metaphorically represented as undertaking a quest or a hunt for a cure, or as looking for clues or a key to curing the syndrome. Although the vast majority of metaphors focused on biomedical responses to dementia, in a small minority of cases, the articles drew on gambling metaphors to critique inconsistency in the provision of social care, with the public positioned as being at the mercy of a postcode lottery or a Russian roulette regarding the social care services that were available to them and how prepared their local hospitals were to treat people with dementia. So this has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of a wider program of work that I'm undertaking at the minute, and maybe I can talk, if people are interested, I can talk about that more in the break or later on. But I hope I've been able to illustrate some of the more prominent metaphorical patterns in this data set. The analysis uncovered a range of metaphors with the particular prominence of anthropomorphizing ones, which equate dementia variously to a companion, a competitor, and most commonly to a sort of violent killer, an agent that inflicts forms of violence. Almost all metaphors foreground the agency of dementia, in many cases, like I say, rendering it as a sort of social actor, while they background and often preclude altogether the agency of people diagnosed with the syndrome. As an agent of force, dementia moves and invades, it races against and hides from those seeking to remedy it, and it competes with other conditions to become the leading cause of death. People with dementia, meanwhile, are largely denied agency and tend instead to be rendered as the target of violent actions, such as murder and theft. Violence metaphors have the potential to stigmatize by framing people affected by an illness as an enemy of a war and their bodies as metaphorical battlefields. And indeed, we saw how parts of the press could frame parts of the brain in a person with dementia as treacherous weapons which inflict violence on the rest of the brain. A further issue I'd argue with that some of the use of some of these violence metaphors is that if the disease prevails and the person fails to recover, then those affected could be viewed as having lost this battle. And given that dementia is a chronic syndrome and currently doesn't have a known cure, this is a battle that people who are diagnosed will inevitably lose. Yet dementia stigma is propagated not only through, through metaphors of violence, but also I'd argue by the widest set of metaphorical framings that I've identified, including those of horrors and nightmares, and the dehumanizing equation of people with dementia to waste that's being disposed of. All of these prominent tropes foreground dementia's most disastrous and fear-inducing aspects, while backgrounding, if not shutting down altogether, the possibility of living well with dementia following diagnosis, as many people do when they receive the right support. The impacts of dementia stigma on people's lives and society as a whole can be quite severe. It can engender feelings of shame in people with dementia and prevent them from seeking diagnosis and medical support, as well as making them less likely to participate in research. It can also create fear and misunderstanding among the general public, and it can even make them fearful of interacting with people with dementia. While people with dementia were rendered as providing, I'm nearly there, can I just have another 20 seconds? It's okay. As providing little, if any, opposition to the syndrome, agency was instead ascribed to those responsible for developing curative solutions. And this focus not only results in emphasis being placed on prospective treatments that are not currently available, but it also shifts focus away from other non-biomedical responses, such as art-based therapies, as well as other initiatives that are designed to help people manage the syndrome in the here and now. The defense of these metaphors is that they allow newspapers to reify what is in dementia an otherwise largely invisible disease and a complex syndrome that can be very difficult to understand, and perhaps to give us a sense that we have a sort of measure of symbolic order over it. But we could also, I'd argue, question the extent to which some of those metaphors are likely to improve public understanding of dementia. So, for example, metaphors which represented dementia's prevalence as large and growing were seldom accompanied by any discussion of the sort of epidemiological niceties that might give us an inflated impression of its occurrence, such as the UK's ageing population and improved methods of dementia detection. Of course, this kind of counter-argument might run contrary to sort of the negativity of news values and might make for less sensational headlines, but I think it's important to reflect critically on the ramifications that might have for people living with the syndrome. And finally, my own view is that I think some of the metaphors might be more helpful than others in sort of conveying the reality of life with dementia. So I think those which frame dementia as a journey or which characterize it as companionship could respectively be said to articulate its progressive and chronic nature. The metaphors are also used more flexibly than the violence ones. So the journey metaphor could be used to ascribe agency to a person with dementia and to foreground its positive aspects, but also of the positive aspects of life with dementia, but also the negative aspects too. So perhaps these kinds of metaphors can account more flexibly for differences in subjective experiences of dementia, as well as variations in an individual's experiences over time. And there I can stop. Sorry for slightly running over.